this decision by the ICC has been applauded by Hamas and Iran, and apparently by our own British government as well. And that alone is utterly depressing, because it places us very much on the wrong side here. And we just need to look to America, where even Joe Biden has come out strongly condemning the court for this disgraceful act. In Britain, not so much. And we've got other Western states as well who are now in this deeply shameful position. We should actually be rejecting this outright and rallying to Israel's support. I mean, the president of Argentina has announced an Argentina-Israel alliance against terrorism in response, which is a bit more like it. What they've done, the ICC, is basically to politicize and criminalize self-defense against terrorism. And this move also discredits previous judgments against real war criminals like Vladimir Putin. It's unlikely to lead to a trial for Benjamin Netanyahu, but it is a clarifying moment, because it shows us who is actually on the right side of things here, which nations, as the world has to realign itself painfully slowly, which nations are aligning themselves on the side of barbaric threats and our enemies, and which nations are aligning themselves against those barbaric threats. And we in Britain are not coming out of this one well at the moment.
There are those who would point to the 40,000 people who have been killed by Israel in that statistic. What, of course, they don't remember is that that statistic comes from the health authorities in Gaza, who are the health authorities controlled by Hamas. Who are Hamas? Terrorists. What do terrorists do? Lie. So there are lots of journalists who wouldn't trust Wikipedia, but they trust Hamas terrorists who say there are 40,000 people dead. But I think what we do know is that lots of people are dead in Gaza. Gaza is a horrible place. It's a terrible place. It's been certainly dealt with very, very severely by Israel. There are civilian casualties there. What would you say to those people who would suggest that Benjamin Netanyahu actually has committed war crimes because of what we see in Gaza, and that actually there should be some international condemnation and prosecution as a result?
Well, if we just look at the allegations themselves, Israel's accused of deliberately targeting civilians, but actually we all know that it does everything in its power to avoid civilian casualties.
Are you sure it does?
Well, yes. I mean, as far as one can tell from actually looking at evidence, if you come to it from a position of prejudice against Israel, from the assumption that it's a bloodthirsty country full of bloodthirsty Jews trying to murder civilians and babies, then you may not look at the evidence fairly. But it has sent millions of text messages, phone calls, leaflets. Hamas does everything in their power to keep civilians in harm's way, including actually shooting at them and using them as human shields.
Because they want the propaganda victory of higher death rates, and they want to paint Israel as they don't care about the people. Hamas don't care about the people.
And Israel's been accused of deliberately starving the population of the Gaza Strip when it's actually provided 700,000 tons of food to feed the people of Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu pointed out that's 3,200 calories for every person in the Gaza Strip. Those supplies are constantly looted by Palestinian terrorists. Even the UN this week had to admit that. They said that there was a record amount of looting that happened this week. So I do think that these allegations don't ring true, and I think that they are obviously part of a prejudiced decision against the state of Israel by this court.
Yeah, it's really weird when you talk about that looting. The BBC reported it, but in their headline didn't actually point to the fact that it was Hamas terrorists who did it. That's a really strange thing for the BBC to do. Absolutely no idea why that would be the case. What do you think happens now, Jonathan?
Well, I think that it's unlikely there's going to be a trial. That's for sure. The court's pretty useless in that respect. But I think that this is, as I said, quite an important moment. Netanyahu referred to this as a modern-day Dreyfus affair. And for those who don't really know anything about Dreyfus, what he was referring to, it's worth mentioning that the Dreyfus trial was a famous one, a controversy in France that occurred between 1894 and 1906, when Captain Alfred Dreyfus, who was a Jewish officer in the French army, was wrongfully convicted of treason for allegedly passing military secrets to Germany. And eventually, after years of public debate and advocacy, he was exonerated. And I must say that the comparison's an important one because, like the Dreyfus affair, I think this will be seen as a turning point moment when it's become clear that corrupt courts or weak courts can be hijacked by people who wish to use them against Jews, against the Jewish state in this instance. And it will become a historical example of just when the ICC really signed its own death warrant. The US, even under Biden, has said that this is outrageous. Trump will, of course, go even further. In the past, Trump actually sanctioned the ICC and members of it. When he comes back in power in January, if he freezes their bank accounts, it's not going to be operating very well for very long. I think that the ICC needs to think long and hard about this. And that's not bullying on the part of America. It's simply America standing up for justice, because this is an absolute travesty of justice to try and put this sort of arrest warrant on a state which is defending itself against bloodthirsty murderers that invaded the country, killed, raped, pillaged, burned people in their beds. It's really unthinkable that in a case of a righteous and justified war like this, Israel is being accused of the things that it is, when the ICC hasn't done that to plenty of other people around the world in very clear, cut and dried cases of absolute crimes against humanity. This certainly isn't one of them.
There has been condemnation here in the UK of the International Criminal Court as well. Suella Braverman, the Conservative MP, says it is making a mockery of the law. She says the issuing of an arrest warrant from the ICC for Israeli ministers is outrageous and brings the ICC into disrepute. Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, says the ICC has no credibility. The UK should not enforce this farcical arrest warrant from a politicised court that is itself marred in scandal. Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform UK, criticising the International Criminal Court's decision, saying the court loses more credibility with each day that passes. Just finally, Jonathan, I just wonder whether you think if Benjamin Netanyahu comes to the UK, whether he would actually be arrested. I mean, logically, that would appear to be the case, but Yvette Cooper has refused, the Home Secretary, has refused to confirm or deny whether that would actually happen.
Well, listen, our Labour government is definitely not showing itself to be a solid friend of Israel. And she may have avoided the question, but she didn't say no. She didn't say yes. She just sort of prevaricated, talked around it, said that it was an unlikely event. We've also heard that in the past, before the actual issuing of this arrest warrant, that they did say that they would go along with it and potentially arrest Netanyahu and Galant. And I think that this is, it's an absolutely outrageous way to treat an ally. Let's not forget, by the way, that Israeli security cooperation with the UK has helped save lives here in the UK. But those sorts of things can't be taken for granted. It's, again, not a threat, but how can Israel and the UK still continue to interact on that sort of level if the UK is giving some sort of credence to the idea that the Prime Minister and the former Defence Minister of that state are international war criminals who are deliberately trying to starve the Gazan population? I just don't see how they could even want to continue that sort of cooperation with a state that they think that about. It's just so ill thought out. It's so against all ethical, moral signs, and it's not justice. It's an absolute travesty of justice. It's a hijacking of international justice in order to try to attack the Jewish state. And I think there are many Jewish people today who are looking at this around the world, thinking once again, as after that Dreyfus affair, Theodor Herzl was famously inspired in part by that when he came up with the idea of Zionism, the need for a Jewish state to look after Jewish people because the world simply would not protect us. And here we're seeing it again. We've seen that the police don't protect us in the face of Jew hatred in the streets. We've seen that academia doesn't protect us. In fact, Jew hatred is allowed in universities. It's even taught in some of them. We've seen now that the courts, the international courts, are being harnessed against us to perpetuate these anti-Jewish racisms. I think that Jews are understandably very concerned.
Jonathan Sacerdoti, with his own version of J'accuse there, the journalist and broadcaster, thank you very much indeed for joining us